The morning my boss found out the truth. The office smelled like burnt espresso and printer toner. And my sister was wearing my idea like it had been tailored for her. She stood at the front of the executive conference room in a cream blazer, one hand wrapped around a laser pointer, the other resting lightly against the glass table, as if she were studying the entire company with nothing but confidence. Outside the windows, downtown Chicago looked cold and silver under a March sky. And inside that room, every warm voice, every impressed nod, every quiet scribble of approval was aimed at her. At the time, all I did was sit 3 chairs from the end, keep my face still, and listen to Richard Hollis call her the sharpest strategic mind in the department. I remember the exact wording because it felt like something hitting bone. Sharpest strategic mind. 8 years. 8 years of late nights and missed birthdays and drafts saved under my name before being presented under hers. 8 years of hearing my older sister turn my work into her charm, my data into her instinct, my discipline into her performance. And that morning, for the first time, something in the room shifted. I didn't know it yet. I only knew Richard was asking questions Vanessa had never been able to answer on her own. And for the first time in a very long time, she looked directly at me before she spoke. That was always the tell. Before I tell you how it all blew up, let me take you back to where it started. And if this story resonates with you, like and subscribe, only if it does. Because there are people who know exactly what it means to build quietly, while somebody else gets celebrated loudly. And when that person is your own family, the theft doesn't just take your work, it changes the shape of your voice. My name is Lena Mercer. And by the time everything collapsed, I was 32 years old. Exhausted in ways sleep never fixed. And so used to being overlooked that I had almost started doing it for other people before they could do it to me first. Vanessa was 35. She was my sister, my first role model, my first rival, and for most of my life, the person everyone else in the family seemed to orbit. She had the kind of beauty people describe with lazy words like effortless and natural. Even though I knew how much time went into the curling iron, the careful makeup, the soft colors, the studied laugh, she could walk into a room and make strangers feel as if they had already agreed with her. She had warmth without substance, charm without follow-through, a way of talking that made half-finished thoughts sound visionary. I had always been the opposite. Quieter, less decorative. The kind of person who noticed patterns before people noticed me. When we were girls, our mother used to stand in the kitchen under the yellow light over the sink and say things like, "Vanessa is gifted with people, and Lena is gifted with computers." It never sounded like praise. The kitchen always smelled like coffee and lemon dish soap in those years. Even now, when I catch that combination somewhere, I feel 12 again, standing near the doorway with a math workbook in my arms. Listening to the adults in my life sort my sister and me into categories as if that were the same thing as loving us equally. Vanessa was the visible child. I was the reliable one. She was the story. I was the footnote. The imbalance did not arrive dramatically. It grew the way mold does quietly, in corners, until one day, it is part of the house. Vanessa forgot chores and still got called spirited. I remembered everything and got called serious. Vanessa interrupted people and got called confident. I waited my turn and got told I needed to speak up. At family events, my father liked to tell everyone that Vanessa would probably run a company one day because she had presence. Then he would nod in my direction and say I would probably keep one running, because I was good with details. Everyone laughed. He meant it as a compliment. That somehow made it worse. By high school, Vanessa had learned something I was still too young to name. In our family, presentation mattered more than contribution. She knew how to turn being loved into leverage. She knew how to apologize without changing. How to flirt with forgiveness. How to make any consequence feel like an overreaction from someone else. When I was 16, she borrowed my English paper because she said she only needed help outlining hers. She turned in my structure, my argument, my research order, and my phrasing with a few swapped adjectives. Her teacher praised the depth of it. Mine accused me of imitating my older sister's style. That should have been the warning. Instead, it became the pattern. We grew up in Naperville, in a 2-story house with beige siding, trimmed hedges, and a dining room my mother only used when guests came over. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people assumed was stable. My father worked in regional sales for a medical supply company. My mother had been a dental receptionist until Vanessa was born and never went back full-time. Money was never lavish, but it was enough to keep the image polished. Inside, the rules were different. Inside, love followed usefulness and admiration, followed performance. And Vanessa was very good at performance. I left for college with a scholarship and a laptop that overheated if I ran too many programs at once. I studied analytics, consumer behavior, and business communications because I liked the logic of systems. I liked finding what people missed. I liked the feeling of turning messy information into something clear, structured, and useful. It felt honest in a way family never had. Vanessa stayed closer to home, drifted through a communications degree, and called me when she needed help writing papers, polishing resumes, and fixing presentations. Back then, it still felt normal. Siblings help each other. That was what I told myself. When I graduated, the job market was ugly, and I was hungry enough to say yes to anything that looked like a doorway. Vanessa was already working at Hollis & Vale, a mid-sized brand consulting firm downtown with glossy clients, brutal deadlines, and the kind of internal culture that rewarded confidence faster than accuracy. She had been there just under a year when she called me one rainy Thursday evening and asked if I wanted to come in as a contractor. "It's not glamorous," she said. "Mostly back-end support, analytics, market trend reports, helping me prep for client pitches. But it gets your foot in the door." Your foot. Not mine. Not yours. I should have noticed that too. Still, I said yes. I was 24. Rent was due. My student loan grace period was ending. And some part of me still believed that proximity to my sister might finally become partnership if I proved myself useful enough. The first month at Hollis & Vale felt like being dropped into moving traffic. The office occupied 2 floors of a glass and steel building near the river. Everything was branded in muted tones: charcoal, ivory, brushed brass. The lobby smelled faintly of eucalyptus and floor polish. The women on the client-facing teams wore silk blouses and shoes that never squeaked. The men all seemed to own the same expensive navy coat. Conversations happened while walking. Praise was brief. Mistakes lasted. I was hired under Vanessa's team as a junior strategy analyst on temporary contract. She introduced me to everyone with one hand on my shoulder and the same line every time. "This is my little sister, Lana. She's brilliant with numbers. And thankfully, not as antisocial as she used to be." People laughed politely. I smiled because I had been doing that my whole life. At first, the theft was small enough to excuse. Vanessa would ask me to clean up slides for a client meeting she claimed was last minute. Then she would present those slides herself, and later mention that she had stayed up all night refining them. She would ask me to look over market segmentation data and suggest talking points. Then, in the meeting, she would repeat those points nearly word for word, with the same pauses I used when explaining why the numbers mattered. Once, during my second month, I built an audience behavior model for a retail campaign we were pitching to a regional chain in Ohio. I still remember the spreadsheet tabs: seasonality, demographic elasticity, competitor lag, in-store conversion estimates. I had color-coded every assumption and cross-checked every variable because I was terrified of making a mistake. The next morning, Vanessa marched into the meeting with the model printed in a sleek-bound packet and told the room she had spent all weekend building a predictive consumer response framework from scratch. From scratch. I sat against the wall taking notes while 3 senior people complimented her initiative. Afterward, she found me in the hallway and kissed my cheek. "Relax," she said. "Your work still matters. We're a team. We're a team." That phrase became her favorite disinfectant. Whenever I looked hurt, she called us a team. Whenever I asked a question, she said, "The team won." Whenever I hinted that maybe my contribution should be visible, she put on that wounded older sister face and said, "Are you seriously keeping score with me?" At home, if I mentioned it to our mother, she sighed and told me this was how workplaces functioned. "Vanessa is more senior," she said. "Of course she presents more. You're getting experience. Don't be petty." Pettu. I noticed that word always showed up whenever I wanted fairness. After 6 months, my contract was extended. After 9, I was made permanent. Officially, I worked under Vanessa. Unofficially, I did the work of 2 people and half of hers. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself real recognition would come if I stayed patient. I told myself competence had a way of surfacing eventually. That was the first lie I repeated, so often it started sounding wise. The truth was uglier. Competence without ownership is a resource, and I had become one. By the end of year 2, Vanessa had learned exactly how to use me. She never stole in ways that left obvious fingerprints. She didn't take entire files from my folders and slap her name on them. That would have been crude. Instead, she worked in layers. She would ask me to draft the bones of something for brainstorming. She would have me run scenarios, prepare messaging options, clean up numbers, anticipate objections, or summarize client research because I was so much faster at that stuff. Then she would take the strongest material, wrap it in her delivery, and present it as if the thinking had happened in her head first. Sometimes she would give me partial credit in private, never in public. And public was where careers were built. Over time, I stopped expecting her to change and started trying to outwork the situation. I came in earlier. I stayed later. I made my reports cleaner, sharper, harder to dismiss. I thought if I made myself undeniable enough, the truth would force its own way into the room. But offices are like families in one dangerous way. Once a role has been assigned to you, people prefer you continue performing it. Vanessa was the face. I was the mechanism. And mechanisms don't get celebrated unless they break. By year 3, she had been promoted to senior brand strategist. I had still not been promoted out of support track analyst. Richard Hollis, our department director. I liked Vanessa because she was fast on her feet, easy with clients, and comfortable taking up oxygen. He liked me too, I think, but in the way people appreciate good plumbing, quietly, only when it works. He would stop by my desk sometimes late in the evening, when most of the office had emptied, and ask if I was still running those comparative models. I would say yes. He would nod, sigh, good work, and keep walking. Meanwhile, Vanessa got invited to dinners after client wins, conferences out of state, internal leadership circles, and all the little invisible rooms where actual upward motion begins. I remained where useful women often remain, close to the engine, far from the spotlight. Around year 4, something changed in me. Not enough to leave, just enough to start documenting. I wish I could tell you this came from strategy and self-respect. But honestly, it came from a single humiliating meeting in October. The company had landed a new wellness brand trying to reposition after a public misstep. The account was messy, politically sensitive, and worth enough money to make everyone tense. Vanessa asked me to work through the weekend with her to build a recovery strategy. We spent 14 hours on Saturday and another 10 on Sunday in an empty office with humming fluorescent lights and vending machine coffee. I built the sentiment recovery model, mapped the audience trust drop, and designed the phased messaging architecture. Vanessa mostly paced, texted, and occasionally asked for something more elegant. Monday morning, she presented the whole plan to Richard and 2 partners. At one point, one of the partners, an older man with silver glasses and the tired patience of someone who'd sat through too many mediocre decks, paused her and asked, "This trust rehabilitation arc in phase 2 is clever? How did you land on that sequencing?" Vanessa didn't blink. She said, "Instinct. Honestly, instinct." I was sitting 10 feet away with my notebook open, and something inside me went cold. Not angry. Not yet. Cold. Because in that instant, I understood the real danger wasn't just that she kept taking from me. It was that she had started believing the theft had become identity. She didn't even seem to think she was lying anymore. She thought proximity to my work had made it hers. That night, I began forwarding versions of my completed reports to a personal email. Nothing dramatic. Just copies, timestamps, draft histories, version notes. I also stopped sending Vanessa fully polished work unless she forced the deadline. If she asked for 5 options, I sent 3 and held 2 back. If she asked for messaging angles, I summarized the logic but kept my source language offline. Not because I was plotting revenge. Not yet. Because some instinct deeper than politeness had finally woken up and whispered, "Save your own trail." The years kept moving. That's the cruel part of long betrayals. They don't feel like a story while you're inside them. They feel like weather. Something you adapt to. Something that reshapes your posture so gradually you forget you were ever standing straight. At 27, I missed my best friend's engagement party because Vanessa needed a last-minute turnaround on a pharmaceutical rebranding pitch. At 28, I spent Thanksgiving morning in my apartment rewriting talking points while my mother texted me reminders not to make things awkward by showing up late again. At 29, I watched Vanessa receive an Internal Excellence Award for a client retention strategy I had built in a spreadsheet at 2 in the morning while eating stale almonds from the break room machine. She accepted the plaque with one hand over her heart. Then she texted me later that night. Couldn't have done it without you. Love you. Love you. That may have been the sentence that made me hate my own hope more than I hated her. Because every now and then she would soften just enough to keep me from calling the whole thing what it was. She would bring me coffee. She would tell a story at a family dinner about how smart I was. She would insist I was the only person she could trust. Trust. Another word she used whenever she needed labor, she didn't want to acknowledge. Somewhere in year 5, I met Ethan. He was a project manager from Operations Steady. Kind. Observant. The kind of man who refilled the office water pitcher without announcing it and remembered how everyone took their coffee. We started talking during late nights on overlapping deadlines. He had a dry sense of humor and a face that only got more attractive the longer you looked at it, which felt rare and honest in a world built on immediate impressions. One night, around 9:30, he found me in the small lounge near the west window, staring at my laptop like it had personally offended me. "You look like you're negotiating with a hostage situation," he said. I laughed before I could stop myself. That may have been the first real laugh I'd had at work in months. Ethan sat down, handed me half a granola bar from the vending machine, and asked what had me there so late again. I almost lied. Instead, I said, "My sister is presenting tomorrow." He looked confused. "And that means you have to be here?" I stared at him. That was when I realized how strange my normal sounded to people who hadn't grown up inside it. Over the next few months, Ethan became the first person at work who looked at the dynamic between Vanessa and me without automatically accepting it as natural. He never pushed too hard. He just asked questions. "Did she write that? Are you getting credit for any of this? Why are you on the support side if you're building strategy?" Each question felt both simple and unbearable. I brushed most of them off. I wasn't ready. Maybe because saying the truth out loud would have required admitting that I had helped build my own cage. Around that time, Richard hired a new VP over our division. A woman named Celeste Warren. Celeste had the kind of presence that made vanity seem inefficient. She didn't care who was charming. She cared who was precise. In meetings, she listened with her chin tipped slightly down and her fingers steepled. And when someone said something vague, she asked follow-up questions until the vagueness died. Vanessa hated her almost immediately. "She's cold," Vanessa said after their first big client review. I remember looking up from my screen and thinking, "No, she's disciplined." But I didn't say that. Celeste didn't undo the structure overnight. But she changed the air. She started asking for methodology notes. She wanted supporting logic, not just polished takeaways. She wanted client strategy memos stored in central archives with version history. She wanted accountability trails. Vanessa adapted just enough to survive. I noticed because I was the one helping her adapt. She started asking me for more detailed documentation before meetings. She asked me to sit closer. She had me build backup files in case Celeste asked technical questions. And when Celeste did ask those questions, Vanessa would turn slightly in her chair, not enough for anyone to call it obvious. Just enough to catch my eye. Then I would answer in a low voice. Or pass her a note. Or pull up the appendix. Or quietly save her from exposure. Again. 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 If you've ever done this, you know how it happens. Not with one terrible decision, but with 100 small refusals to let a bad person fail because part of you is still trying to prove you are better than they are. All you end up proving is that you are available. By year 6, Ethan and I were dating. We kept it quiet for a while because office gossip spread fast. And I had no interest in letting Vanessa turn my private life into social material. When I finally told her, she smiled too widely and said, "Wow, good for you. Good for you." Then, after a beat, she added, "Just be careful. Men like him notice confident women." I understood what she meant. Or rather, I understood the petty little dart underneath it. What I did not understand yet was how threatened she had begun to feel. Because Ethan saw me. And people who benefit from your invisibility rarely enjoy competition. Not long after that, Celeste started informally leaning on me for direct answers. She still went through formal chain of command. But in meetings, she would sometimes ask, "Lena, can you walk me through the assumptions there?" Or, "Lena, which scenario tested strongest in the Midwest data?" Each time it happened, Vanessa's smile tightened just slightly. Each time, I answered carefully. Never enough to create a scene. Always enough to be useful. I should have taken that window. I should have stepped forward then. Instead, I kept trying to preserve something that had never really protected me. Family peace. At Christmas that year, my parents hosted dinner at their house. The dining room table had the same heavy centerpiece my mother used. Every December pine cones sprayed gold. Cheap candles and glass hurricanes. White plates. She only trusted Vanessa to help set. The air smelled like rosemary. Roasting meat. And the cinnamon candles my mother burned too aggressively. Halfway through dinner, my father raised a glass and said he was proud of both his daughters. Then he turned to Vanessa. "But especially of this one," he said, smiling. "Climbing that ladder. Always knew you had leadership in you." Then, almost as an afterthought, he looked at me. "And Lena's always been there helping. Team player." The room made its usual sounds. Small laughter. Silverware. My mother nodding like fairness had been achieved. Vanessa reached over and squeezed my wrist. Like she was including me. That night, on the drive home, I sat in Ethan's car watching streetlights smear across the wet windshield while he kept both hands on the wheel and said nothing for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Do they even hear themselves?" I stared out the window. "No," I said, "and if they do, they prefer it." He nodded once. Then he said something I was not ready to receive. "One day you're going to stop confusing endurance with love." I didn't answer. Because some truths arrive before you have a place to put them. The 7th year was when the stakes became impossible to ignore. Hollis and Vale began pitching for a major national account, Astor BioWell, a wellness and supplement brand trying to break into a more premium market. It was the biggest opportunity our division had seen in years. The account meant bonuses, visibility, and likely at least one executive track promotion. Richard put Vanessa on lead strategy. I was assigned as back-end analytics and research support. Of course I was. The project consumed everything. We worked late almost every night. Whiteboards filled and erased. Draft decks multiplied. Messaging pillars shifted 3 times in 2 weeks. The account required a synthesis of behavioral data, pricing sensitivity, retail psychology, digital trust signals, and post-pandemic consumer hesitations. It was exactly the kind of work I was built for. Vanessa knew it too. She started spending more time at my desk than her own. At first, she played it lightly. Can you just rough out the audience tiers? Can you sanity check these pricing assumptions? Can you give me a cleaner strategic frame for slide 12? Then it escalated. Can you rebuild the whole architecture? Celeste thinks it's too shallow. I need 3 differentiated positioning routes by tomorrow. Richard wants a more defensible narrative. Just tell me what you'd say if it were your presentation. If it were your presentation. I nearly laughed the first time she said that. Instead, I worked. Because buried inside my exhaustion was one stupid hope. This project was so big, so visible, so demanding, that maybe this time the truth would finally become impossible to hide. Maybe this time authorship would matter. Maybe this time Richard or Celeste would notice whose fingerprints were actually on the thinking. I spent 6 weeks building the strategy architecture for Aster Biowell. 6 weeks. I still remember the cadence of it, the glow of my monitor in my apartment after midnight, the sound of buses sighing at the curb below my window, the smell of takeout containers stacked by the sink because I no longer had energy to cook. I remember tracking consumer trust behavior across 7 regional segments, building competitive whitespace maps, designing a 3-phase brand repositioning model with alternate messaging depending on acquisition cost pressure, writing appendix notes no one would read unless they needed proof that the logic existed. I gave Vanessa the framework in layers, not because I trusted her, but because the whole project would fail if I didn't. And if the project failed, somehow that would still become my fault. By then, I understood the role I occupied not just in our family, but in the office narrative too. Vanessa was visible enough to be associated with success. I was buried enough to absorb blame. That combination is paradise for the wrong kind of person. 2 weeks before the final internal presentation, Ethan came by my desk around 8:15 with takeout soup and sat down without asking. "You look pale," he said. "I am pale. You know what I mean." I did. I rubbed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. The office around us had mostly emptied. Cleaning crews moved in the distance, somewhere behind us. A copier coughed and reset. "She's going to do it again," he said quietly. I didn't pretend not to understand. "She always does." Ethan was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "And what are you going to do?" That question stayed between us like a door I wasn't ready to open. "What can I do?" I asked. He gave me a look I can still picture perfectly. Not pity, not frustration. Something steadier. "You can stop making it easy." The next day, I began keeping more than drafts. I saved meeting requests, Slack summaries, time-stamped working files, annotated versions, research source exports. Even the voice memos I dictated to myself on the train when ideas came too fast to type. Not because I had decided to expose her, because I was finally accepting the possibility that one day I might need to prove I existed inside my own work. The final internal review for Aster was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. Richard, Celeste, 2 partners from executive leadership, Vanessa presenting, me attending as support. The weekend before, Vanessa came to my apartment Sunday evening, carrying expensive pastries and a face full of false sisterhood. My apartment was small but clean, with dark green curtains, overwatered plants on the windowsill, and books stacked on the floor because I had long since run out of shelves. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Ethan had left an hour earlier after helping me reorganize some financial files. and the room still held the faint smell of his cedar cologne. Vanessa set the pastry box on my counter and gave me a long look. "You look tired," she said. "You came here to tell me that?" She laughed lightly, like I was being difficult for sport. "No, I came because I know this project has been intense for both of us." "Both of us." I folded my arms and waited. She moved through my apartment like she was touring a temporary space she'd never have to imagine herself in. Then she turned and lowered her voice. "I need one more thing." Of course she did. She said Richard wanted the presentation to feel more proprietary, more executive, less like a compilation of insights and more like a unified strategic philosophy. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means I need a better opening frame and a stronger close." I looked at her, then write them. Something flashed across her face. "Lena." "No." She took a breath and changed tactics. "Don't do this right now. We are too close." We, always we, when she needed something. "I already built the deck." I said, "I already built the model. I already fixed the messaging transitions you broke twice. What exactly is left for you?" That landed. She went still. For a second, the room felt honest. Then she smiled. And that frightened me more than anger would have. "You're upset," she said softly. "I get it. But don't sabotage this because you're emotional." Emotional. There it was. The family word. The office word. The tidy little label used whenever I moved 1 inch too close to self-respect. "I'm not sabotaging anything," I said. "I'm refusing to keep ghostwriting your confidence." The silence after that was so complete I could hear the refrigerator motor click on. Vanessa stared at me. Then, very calmly, she said, "Do you really think anyone will believe that?" I didn't answer. She picked up her handbag. "Be careful, Lena," she said. "You're good at support work. But people like Richard don't promote resentment. They promote leadership." Then she left. I stood in the middle of my kitchen long after the door closed, staring at the untouched pastries on the counter like they had personally insulted me. That night, I barely slept. At 2:11 a.m. I got up, made tea, and opened every Aster working file I had touched. Anabiwan. I organized them into folders on an encrypted drive and mirrored them to a secure personal cloud account. Draft progression, version histories, source logic, early framework sketches, metadata, even side-by-side comparisons showing how Vanessa's executive summary language had appeared in my original notes days earlier. Atre, chassea, m. I found something I had forgotten existed. A recorded Teams call from 6 weeks earlier. I used to record some internal brainstorming sessions when deadlines were tight, so I could revisit details without relying on memory. Most of the time, I deleted them once the work was done. This one had survived because I had named it badly and missed it in a cleanup pass. I clicked play. At first, it was just static. Keyboard taps, and my voice walking through the Aster segmentation architecture. Vanessa kept interrupting with vague phrases like, "Can we make it sexier?" and "What's the higher level energy here?" I almost closed it. Then, 12 minutes in, she said something that made me sit up straight in bed. "Okay, so just send me the final strategic narrative and I'll present it like it came from our leadership synthesis. Richard doesn't care who built the engine if the car wins." I froze. Then I backed it up 3 times. For the first time in years, I had something beyond inference. Something beyond feeling. Something beyond being quietly right. I had language. Her language. The next morning, I went to work with a strange calm that did not feel like courage yet, but was at least no longer helplessness. I wore a dark navy blouse, low heels, and the silver watch Ethan gave me on my 30th birthday. The sky over the city was the color of wet concrete. By the time I reached the office, my stomach was tight enough to make coffee seem impossible. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later, looking radiant. That annoyed me more than it should have. She carried the deck in a slim leather folder, even though everything was digital. She always liked props that suggested importance. As she passed my desk, she rested 2 fingers on the corner of it and said, "Try not to look miserable in there." I looked up at her. "Try not to improvise." Her smile sharpened. Then she kept walking. At Noa Zeroa. We entered the executive conference room. Richard was already there. Celeste came in moments later. The partners joined remotely on the large wall screen. I sat in my usual support chair off to the side with my laptop open. Backup files loaded, and the encrypted drive in my bag. The room was too warm. Sunlight slid across the glass wall and made everything look cleaner than it felt. Someone had placed a tray of pastries near the side credenza, and the smell of butter and coffee turned my stomach. Vanessa began, and, to her credit, she performed beautifully. That was the thing about her. She was never untalented, just unearned. She spoke with pace and polish. She moved through the opening story arc as if she had shaped every sentence herself. She described the audience fracture points, the trust gap, the behavioral conversion risks, the 3-phase premium repositioning strategy. Richard nodded along. One of the partners typed continuously. Celeste listened with that unreadable stillness of hers. Then the questions began. At first, easy ones. Market size. Channel sequencing. Pricing sensitivity. Vanessa handled them. Then Celeste asked, "Walk me through why Phase 2 assumes higher retention in suburban women 40 to 54 after quarter 3 rather than quarter 2. There was the slightest pause. Vanessa smiled. That came out of the trust recovery pacing. Celeste waited. The room got quiet. Richard looked from Vanessa to the deck, then back to her. Celeste said, "Yes, I can see that. I'm asking why the pacing inflects there." Vanessa glanced at me. Just for a second, but this time I did not rescue her. Her eyes flicked back to Celeste. She spoke for about 20 seconds without answering the question. Something about narrative readiness, seasonal receptivity, and consumer emotional stabilization. Celeste's face did not change. "Lena," she said suddenly, turning to me. "Can you answer that?" Every nerve in my body lit up. Vanessa went still. I could feel Richard watching. "Yes," I said, and my voice sounded calmer than I felt. The inflection point moved to quarter 3 after we layered in post-summer household budget compression and delayed trust adoption in the Midwest and suburban Northeast segments. If we pulled it earlier, Phase 2 retention weakened under higher price sensitivity. Celeste nodded once. "Thank you," Vanessa resumed. But the room had changed. You can feel it when a lie starts losing oxygen. It happened in small ways first. Richard asked a follow-up about the competitive white space map, and Vanessa answered with language I recognized from my notes, but not enough specificity. One of the partners asked about channel prioritization trade-offs, and she defaulted to broad phrasing that sounded elegant until Celeste asked for the underlying assumptions. Twice more. Celeste turned to me for clarification. Twice more. I answered. By slide 22. Vanessa's confidence was starting to show seams. Then Richard asked the question that cracked everything open. He tapped the table lightly with the back of his pen and said, "This consumer trust architecture is the strongest thinking our division has produced in years. I want to understand its authorship clearly. Because if Aster moves forward, we'll likely build a dedicated lead around whoever originated this strategic framework." The room went silent. My pulse kicked so hard I could hear it. Vanessa smiled and opened her mouth. Vanessa smiled and opened her mouth. It was a collaborative process, she said smoothly, but the strategic direction was mine. Mine. There are moments when the world does not slow down. It sharpens. I remember the fine scratches in the oak table under my hand, the faint hum of the recessed lights, the way Celeste's eyes moved. Not to Vanessa, but to me. I remember Richard leaning back in his chair with the kind of stillness that usually meant he was thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. And I remember, most clearly, in the exact second I understood that if I stayed silent one more time, I would deserve what happened next. Not because I had caused it, but because I would have finally agreed to disappear. Richard looked at me. "Lena?" he said, very evenly. "Is that accurate?" My whole body went cold. Vanessa turned toward me with a warning hidden inside her smile. It was the same look she used when we were girls and she'd broken something. Then waited to see if I would take the blame, because I hated conflict more than she did. For 1/2 second, every old instinct in me rose up at once. Protect the peace. Don't make a scene. Don't embarrass the family. Don't be difficult. Then something else moved underneath it. A quieter voice. A truer one. No more. I folded my hands on the table so no one would see them shake. "No," I said. The room did not explode. It tightened. Richard's gaze sharpened. Celeste did not move. Vanessa laughed softly. Too quickly. What does that mean? It was meant to sound amused. It sounded afraid. I looked at Richard. Not at her. It means the framework wasn't authored the way it was just described. Vanessa's face changed by a degree. Only a degree. But it was enough. "Lena," she said, with a little warning tucked into my name. "I think you're confused about how team contributions work." I'm not confused. My voice surprised me. Not loud. Not emotional. Just clear. The segmentation architecture. The retention pacing logic. The pricing sensitivity model. The regional trust inflection analysis. The 3-phase positioning structure. And the recovery narrative sequencing were built in my working files over the last 6 weeks. I have dated drafts, version histories, and meeting records. Silence. Heavy now. Richard turned slowly toward Vanessa. Then back to me. "Are you saying you originated the strategic framework?" "Yes." Vanessa leaned forward immediately. "That's incredibly misleading." She smiled at the room again. trying to gather control before it fully left her. Lena supported the modeling. Yes, but the actual client strategy was developed collaboratively through leadership synthesis. That's how these things work. Leadership synthesis? I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because even then, even with the floor beginning to tilt beneath her, she was still reaching for performance. Celeste spoke first. Do you have documentation with you? I had imagined this moment 100 times in uglier ways. Me crying. Me stumbling. Me sounding bitter enough for the truth to become secondary. But when she asked that question, all the fear in me narrowed into something useful. Yes, I said. I opened my bag, removed the encrypted drive, and set it gently on the table. Vanessa stared at it as if I had placed a weapon between us. Which, in a way, I had. Richard's expression darkened. What exactly is on that drive? Draft progression, file metadata, timestamped reports, working notes, archived model versions, source export, and recorded internal sessions related to the Aster account. The partner on the screen straightened in his chair. Vanessa laughed again, but this time it cracked in the middle. Seriously? You've been keeping evidence against your own team? Against your own team? There it was again. That old disinfectant. That old trick? Only this time it no longer landed. No. I said, I've been keeping records of my own work. Celeste extended her hand across the table. Give it to me. Vanessa turned to Richard fast. You're really entertaining this? Richard didn't answer her. He was watching me. Or maybe he was reviewing the last few years in his own mind and noticing things he had missed because charm had always arrived at the front of the room while labor sat off to the side. Celeste passed the drive to an IT manager who had joined remotely for technical support earlier in the presentation. She asked him to pull the file history through the secure display system. The screen changed. Folders. Dates. Version names. My name. My name again. My name everywhere. It is hard to explain what that felt like. Not triumph. Not at first. More like seeing your own reflection after years of only being described by other people. Familiar. Startling. Almost painful. Celeste opened the earliest architecture file. Then another. Then a comparison window that showed progression over time. Each version deepened the same logic, refined the same model, built the same narrative spine. My notes were there in the margins. My language, my structure, my timestamps. The original naming conventions I always used when building framework trees. Vanessa's face lost color slowly, like a room dimming at dusk. Richard asked, Vanessa, do you want to explain this? She inhaled, and for the first time since I had known her, she had no elegant answer ready. It was collaborative. She said again, weaker this time. Lena and I always work closely. She knows I present. That's been the structure. Structure. As if exploitation sounded more reasonable when arranged neatly. Celeste clicked open a transcript file. It was the team's call. My stomach turned over. Not because I feared it. Because I suddenly knew this was over. The recording played. First, my voice, walking through Aster's segmentation logic, then Vanessa interrupting, then the sentence. Clear as glass. Okay. So, just send me the final strategic narrative, and I'll present it like it came from our leadership synthesis. Richard doesn't care who built the engine if the car wins. No one in the room moved. The audio continued for another few seconds before Celeste stopped it. The silence afterward felt almost sacred. Richard removed his glasses and set them on the table. He did not look angry in the theatrical way people sometimes do when they want anger to be seen. He looked insulted. Professionally insulted. The kind of anger that calculates consequences. Vanessa turned to me then. Not to the room. To May. And what flashed across her face was not remorse. It was betrayal. As if I had violated something fundamental by finally refusing to let her use me. How long? She asked quietly. Have you been waiting to do this? I should have answered with something sharp. Something satisfying. Instead, what came out was the truth. I wasn't waiting. I said, I was surviving. That landed harder than anything crueler would have. Maybe because it was plain. Maybe because every person in that room could hear the years inside it. Richard stood. Meeting adjourned, he said. His voice was flat, controlled, dangerous. The partners on the screen stayed where they were, suddenly much more alert than before. Celeste asked me to remain seated. Vanessa started speaking fast, talking over the end of the meeting, insisting context mattered. Insisting family dynamics had made collaboration more fluid. Insisting this was being misunderstood. Family dynamics. There it was. At last. Dragged into the light. Celeste turned to her with a look so cold it nearly changed the temperature of the room. This is not a family misunderstanding, she said. This is an authorship and integrity issue inside a live executive pitch. Vanessa tried one more pivot. I elevated the work. That's what senior leadership does. Richard's laugh was short and humorless. You misrepresented authorship during an executive review for a national account? Vanessa opened her mouth. He cut her off. Stop. She stopped. That, more than anything, told me how serious it had become. Vanessa had always believed words could move any wall if she kept speaking long enough. Watching one fail in real time was like watching gravity change. Richard asked HR to join us immediately. Then he asked security to wait outside the conference room. At that word, security, something altered in Vanessa, so visibly it almost felt indecent to witness. Her face seemed to separate from itself, the polished surface and the frightened person underneath it no longer aligned. You cannot be serious, she said. No one answered. She looked at me again. And this time the performance dropped. You did this? She whispered. I met her eyes. No. I said, you did. HR arrived within minutes. Though it felt longer, a woman named Teresa came in carrying a legal pad and the grave look of someone who had already been given enough information to understand that her day had just become very inconvenient. A male security officer waited by the door with his hands clasped in front of him. Not touching anyone. Not needing to. The presence alone changed the shape of the room. Celeste summarized what had happened. Briefly. Clinically. No adjectives. No drama. Vanessa kept trying to interrupt. Teresa asked her twice to let Celeste finish. On the third attempt, Richard told Vanessa that if she continued speaking over the process, she would make an already serious matter worse. That was when she turned on me fully. You think this makes you look good? she snapped. You think anybody respects this? You've always been jealous. Since we were kids? There are things people say when they are cornered that reveal more truth than they intend. Not about the event in front of them, but about the story they have always needed in order to keep living with themselves. Jealous. That had always been the story. If I hurt, I was jealous. If I objected, I was petty. If I wanted credit, I was difficult. She had named my reality with insults for so long that she had started believing the names were facts. I did not raise my voice. I was never jealous of you. I said, I was grieving what you kept taking. That shut the room down again. Teresa asked Vanessa to come with her pending formal review and immediate suspension of systems access. Vanessa stared. Suspension. It had moved faster than even I expected. Her badge was deactivated before she stood up. I know because she tried to tap into the conference room console to retrieve her files, and the system flashed red. One of the cruelest sounds I have ever heard is a denied access beep, after years of someone walking through doors they did not deserve. Vanessa's face went white. She looked at Richard. After everything I've done for this company? Richard didn't flinch. I'm currently trying to determine what exactly that includes. Then he turned to Teresa. Escort her out. She is not to access her office alone. There it was. Not a threat. Not a figure of speech. A decision. Vanessa looked around the room as if reality might reverse itself if she found the right pair of eyes. When that failed, she picked up her handbag with jerky little movements that made her seem suddenly older. Less glamorous, less inevitable. Just a woman in a cream blazer who had confused borrowed authority with something she could keep. As Teresa guided her toward the door, Vanessa twisted back toward me one last time. My sister's eyes were bright. Furious. Disbelieving. This isn't over, she said. Maybe she meant the company. Maybe she meant the family. Maybe she meant the version of me she thought she could still call back into place with guilt. Whatever she meant, I just looked at her. And for the first time in my life, I felt no urge to soften the truth so she could survive it. Then the security officer opened the glass door, and my sister was escorted out. Not dramatically. Not in handcuffs. Not in a scene loud enough to satisfy the version of justice people fantasize about when they are hurting. It was quieter than that, which made it better. Her heels clicked once, twice, then faded into the hallway. And when she was gone, the whole room exhaled. I sat there very still, not triumphant, not shaking, just emptied out. Because when you have been carrying something for 8 years, even setting it down hurts. Richard looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" There was no accusation in his voice. That almost made it harder. I stared at the dark screen where the partners had disconnected. Then at the half-finished coffee near Richard's elbow. Then finally at my own hands. Because the answer was embarrassing in its simplicity. Because she was my sister. I said, and because everyone kept teaching me that keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth. No one answered right away. Celeste did. That lesson has cost this company years. She wasn't wrong. But it had cost me more. The rest of that day unfolded in a blur of statements, file reviews, and stunned conversations behind closed doors. IT verified metadata. HR pulled access records. Legal asked careful questions. Celeste requested direct documentation of every account on which I had substantially contributed under Vanessa's leadership. The deeper they looked, the uglier it became. Aster was only the cleanest example. There were others. Patterns. Repeated language. Duplicated strategic frameworks. Work products that traced back to me and had been represented upward through her. By late afternoon, Richard called me into his office. His office always smelled faintly of leather and coffee grounds. And that day the blinds were half closed against a sky, turning pale blue at the edges. He asked me to sit. Then he spent a full minute looking at the folder in front of him before speaking. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending this appears minor," he said. I nodded. He continued. "We failed you. I failed you." I had imagined those words, too, but I never expected them to matter. And yet they did. Because accountability, when you have been starved of it, does not fix the past, but it does change the air in the room. It makes reality feel less lonely. Richard slid a paper across the desk. It was a formal appointment notice. Interim strategic lead on Aster Biowell. Effective immediately. Pending compensation, restructuring, and title review. I stared at it, then looked up. He held my gaze. This should have happened long before today. I wish I could say I felt victorious. Mostly I felt tired. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once. Then, more quietly, "And for what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to prove this at all." When I left his office, Ethan was waiting near the elevators with 2 paper cups in his hands. He took one look at my face and handed me the hotter cup without asking which one I wanted. "Tia," he said, "not coffee." I let out a laugh that broke halfway through and turned into something dangerously close to tears. He didn't crowd me, just stood there beside me while people moved in the distance and the evening light slid gold across the floor. "Finally," he said. "You okay?" I thought about it, then answered honestly. "No." I said, "But I think I might be real again." That night, my mother called. Of course she did. By then, Vanessa had already told some version of the story to the family. I could hear it in my mother's tone before she said a single word. Sharp. Breathless. Morally indignant in that selective way people become, when accountability threatens someone they identify with. "What did you do?" she asked. "No, hello." "No, how are you?" Just accusation. I stood in my apartment kitchen with one heel off, the other still on. My bag on the counter. The city outside my window blinking into evening. I told the truth. My mother exhaled hard. She said you humiliated her at work. I closed my eyes. She humiliated herself. Lena. That tone, the one reserved for when my honesty was becoming socially inconvenient. "She is your sister." "Yes," I said. "She was." There was a silence, so shocked it almost sounded theatrical. Then my mother lowered her voice, as if intimacy would make manipulation feel like care. "Families work things out privately." "No," I said. "Healthy families do. This family buries things privately and calls that love." She inhaled sharply. I kept going. Because once the truth starts moving, it resents being pushed back underground. For years, All of you watched her take from me. At school, at work, at home. You called me sensitive when I noticed. You called me petty when I objected. You called me loyal when I stayed quiet. I'm done participating in that. My mother began to cry. That sound would have undone me once. Not because it proved I was wrong, but because I had been trained to treat her pain as proof that I had gone too far. This time, I let it be what it was. A consequence. When she saw the crying wasn't changing my voice, she shifted to anger. So you destroy your sister's career? I looked out at the reflected lights in the darkening glass. She built it on theft? Then I hung up. My hands shook after. Not with regret. With withdrawal. That is another thing. No one tells you about boundaries. Even the right one can feel like grief if you were raised to think access was the price of belonging. Vanessa texted me after midnight. You smug, bitter little fraud. You think one stunt erases who everyone knows you are? A minute later. You've always needed my life to matter. Then, Mom is devastated. Dad is furious. Hope it was worth it. I set the phone face down and did not answer. The next morning, there were 5 missed calls from my father and 3 voicemails I did not listen to. At lunch, my aunt sent a message saying, family should not turn on family in public. By evening, a cousin I had not spoken to in 11 months sent me a long paragraph about Grace. Grace. Amazing how often people ask for grace on behalf of the person who caused the wound, and not the person who bled quietly for years. I blocked Vanessa first. Then, after 2 more days of pressure disguised as concern, I muted my parents. Not forever. Just long enough to hear my own thoughts again. Work changed quickly. Faster than family ever does. Celeste moved me into direct strategy leadership on Aster and 2 smaller accounts under review. People who had barely looked at me before suddenly asked for my input in rooms where my presence used to feel accidental. Some of it was sincere. Some of it was guilt. Some of it was the ordinary office instinct to align with whoever is now visible. I noticed all of it. And I trusted very little of it at first. That, too, is part of recovery. When the truth comes out, the world doesn't instantly become safe. It just becomes less warped. Over the next month, the company completed its formal review. Vanessa's suspension became termination. HR cited intentional misrepresentation of authorship, repeated breaches of professional integrity, and misconduct during executive review. There were whispers about whether she might challenge it legally. But once the archived file histories and recorded call were formally preserved, that possibility thinned out fast. She never came back for a goodbye. A box of her things was mailed to her apartment through a third-party service. The cream blazer from that morning hung on the back of her office chair for nearly 2 days before someone finally removed it. I hated how satisfying that was. Aster moved forward with us. Not because the scandal helped. Because the work was strong. My work. That sentence still took practice. Richard announced my interim promotion in a division meeting 3 weeks later. He kept the explanation professional and brief. Strategic leadership transition, outstanding contribution, exceptional depth of authorship on key accounts. No mention of Vanessa. No public autopsy. Just a correction. After the meeting, people stopped by my desk with congratulations. Careful smiles, and that particular office politeness people wear when they are trying to show support without admitting how much they missed before. Ethan waited until the rush passed. Then he leaned against the partition and said, "So, sharpest strategic mind in the department." I looked up at him. He smiled a little. Someone had to say it accurately. That made me laugh. A real laugh this time. One that felt earned. About 6 weeks later, my father finally reached me in a way I couldn't ignore. A handwritten letter. That alone was unsettling. My father was not a letter man. He was a call you when angry, text you when practical kind of person. The envelope was cream-colored. His blocky handwriting pressed too hard into the paper. I opened it at my kitchen counter on a Sunday morning while rain traced the glass and a kettle hissed softly behind me. The letter was not an apology. Not really. It was a confused document full of phrases like unfortunate situation. Both daughters hurt. And perhaps mistakes were made on all sides. The closest he came to honesty was one line near the end. "I suppose we may have relied on you to be the stronger one." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I sat down at my small table and stared at the wet rooftops outside. Because there it was. The family myth in one tidy sentence. They had relied on me to be stronger. Meaning quieter. More useful. More absorbent. More willing to carry the cost of everyone else's comfort and call that virtue. I did not write back right away. A few days later, my mother left a voicemail softer than the others. She said the house felt strange. She said Vanessa was staying with a friend and barely speaking to anyone. She said maybe, when things cooled down, we could all have dinner and try to heal. Heal. Another word that often means return to the old arrangement without naming what broke. I called her back that evening. Not because I was ready to reconcile, because I was ready to speak plainly. She answered on the second ring. "Lena?" "Yes." A pause. Then, too quickly hopeful. "I'm glad you called." I stood by my living room window and watched traffic move below in ribbons of red and white. "I need you to listen all the way through." I said, "No interrupting." She went quiet. "For years, you asked me to keep the peace. What you meant was, keep Vanessa comfortable. For years, you watched her take and me absorb it. You treated my silence like maturity and her behavior like personality. I'm not doing that anymore." My mother began to say my name. I kept going. "I am not coming to dinner. I am not sitting in a room where what happened gets turned into miscommunication. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on reality. That means no minimizing. No emotional blackmail. No, asking me to make this easier for the person who did it." She was crying again by then. Quietly this time. Not theatrically. Maybe that mattered. Maybe it didn't. Finally, she asked, very softly, "What do you want from us?" The answer came easily. "I want you to stop calling my pain an overreaction just because it inconveniences someone you prefer." That was my boundary. Simple. Unbeautiful. True. She didn't know what to say to it. Neither had I. For most of my life, we ended the call without resolution. That used to terrify me. Now it felt honest. A month later, Celeste asked me to lunch. We went to a place 2 blocks from the office with white tablecloths, quiet lighting, and water glasses too thin to trust. She talked about the next review cycle, the accounts she wanted me to lead, the compensation adjustments Richard had finally pushed through. Then, after the waiter left, she set down her fork and looked at me directly. "You do understand," she said, "that your career was delayed by years." I let out a breath through my nose. Yes. And I thought about the old version of myself, the one who would have rushed to make everyone comfortable, the one who would have turned loss into a character-building lesson before anyone asked. Then I thought about the cost of that reflex. And I'm done apologizing for noticing. Celeste nodded once. Good. That was all she said. Good. There was more dignity in that one word than in half the comfort people had offered me my whole life. Summer came. Then early fall. Work steadied into something almost normal. Though I don't think life ever becomes fully normal after a truth that large. It just reorganizes around what can no longer be denied. Astor became one of our strongest accounts of the year. The framework held. The campaign performed. The promotion became permanent. My title changed. My salary changed. My office changed from a half-visible workstation near the support cluster to a corner-adjacent glass room that still startled me every time I closed the door and realized it belonged to me. Ethan and I celebrated with takeout on my apartment floor because neither of us had the energy for anything polished. He brought wine. I brought a bakery cake. I ate straight from the box with a fork. Around midnight, he looked at me over a paper plate and said, "You know what the weirdest part is?" "What?" "You're calmer now." I smiled. "I'm more tired now." "No," he said. "You're lighter." He was right. Not happy all the time. Not healed in some clean, cinematic way. Lighter. Because carrying anger is heavy. But carrying denial is heavier. Vanessa emailed me once in October from a new address. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. The message was exactly what I should have expected. Half accusation. Half self-pity. A few lines about how I had ruined her life. A paragraph about how unfair corporate politics had always been. A sentence claiming I had weaponized private family dynamics for professional gain. And, buried near the end, one line that almost sounded honest: "I never thought you'd actually choose yourself over me." I read that sentence twice. Then closed the email. Because there it was. The confession she did not mean to make. She had always believed I would choose her. Choose the family system. Choose the silence. Choose the role assigned to me at 12, 16, 24. Choose endurance over truth. And the real betrayal, in her mind, was not what she had done. It was that I had finally stopped consenting to it. I did not reply. Some messages do not deserve response. They deserve recognition. Then distance. Around Thanksgiving, my father asked if we could meet. In person, public place. No, mother. No, Vanessa. I almost refused. Then I surprised myself and said yes. We met at a coffee shop halfway between the suburbs and the city on a windy Saturday afternoon. He looked older than I expected. Not broken, just older, as if certainty had finally begun charging him interest. He held his cup with both hands for a while before speaking. "I should have seen it," he said. I said nothing. He swallowed. "I kept telling myself Vanessa was just more assertive and you were just more modest. I thought that was the whole story. It was a convenient story. I said. He nodded. Yes. That one word did more than the letter had. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I saw something unfamiliar in his expression. Not authority. Not pity. Shame. Parents rarely carry shame well. It does not fit the role they have written for themselves. But when it is real, you can hear the weight of it. I'm sorry, he said. No qualifié. No both sides language. Just that. I wish I could say I forgave him on the spot. I didn't. Forgiveness, if it comes at all, is rarely a lightning strike. It is usually paperwork. Slow, incomplete, revised over time. But I believed him. That mattered too. I'm not pretending nothing happened. I said, I'm not coming back into the family the way it was. He nodded again. I know. And if you want a relationship with me, it can't be built on managing Vanessa's feelings. His mouth tightened, then relaxed. I know that too. We talked for another 40 minutes. Nothing miraculous. No movie ending. Just two adults sitting across from each other with hot coffee between them and years of unspoken damage finally being named in smaller, more bearable pieces. When we left, he touched my shoulder awkwardly before walking to his car. That touch stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it fixed anything, because it didn't pretend to. By Christmas, my mother had softened in tone, if not yet in full understanding. She sent a short card instead of a demand. It said simply, I am trying to see what I refused to see before. I hope time makes me better at it. That was not enough. But it was more honest than she had ever been. Vanessa remained mostly gone. A rumor reached me through extended family that she was freelancing, then consulting, then considering a fresh start. I did not investigate. I did not ask. I was no longer interested in monitoring the aftermath of a fire once I had finally walked out of the building. And that, maybe more than anything, was the real ending. Not her being escorted out. Not the promotion. Not even the apology. The ending was this. I stopped arranging my life around the emotional weather of people who benefited from my silence. That changed everything. Sometimes people imagine vindication as a public moment. A speech. A collapse. A face falling at exactly the right second in front of exactly the right witnesses. And yes, there is satisfaction in that. There is satisfaction in hearing the truth spoken plainly after years of distortion. There is satisfaction in watching a system correct itself, however belatedly. But the deeper vindication is quieter. It is waking up without rehearsing other people's excuses in your head. It is doing work under your own name. It is answering the phone only when respect is on the other end of it. It is learning that loyalty without reciprocity is not noble. It is surrender. And I had surrendered enough. If you're listening to this, and some part of you recognized yourself in it, then hear me carefully. Being the strong one is not the same as being the silent one. Being loving is not the same as being available for harm. And keeping the peace is not a virtue when the peace is built on your disappearance. For 8 years, my sister built a career on my work. The day our boss found out, she was escorted out of the office she thought she owned. But that was not the greatest consequence. The greatest consequence was simpler. She lost access to my labor, to my protection, To the version of me that kept shrinking so she could feel large. And once that version of me was gone, she had nothing left to stand on that she had not stolen. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. And if you've ever had to choose between family approval and your own dignity, leave a comment with the word boundary. Because sometimes one word is the first honest thing we give ourselves.